Hello, American history students. Good of you to come. Glad your teachers were able to secure this time so you could have an opportunity to hear from an expert in the field. Max Page is professor of architecture at UMass Amherst, and he's offering his time. If you're available after the lecture and you're interested in studying architecture at UMass Amherst, he'd be happy to talk to you about it. Max is a Guggenheim Fellow. He was a fellow at the American Academy in Rome, and he was a consultant in Richmond on the excavation of Shockoe Bottom, which was a former slave market. And if you remember from at least my class section, he has spoken here before. The topic of his earlier discussion was the preservation of difficult places and the Confederate monument controversy, which is very current. He has written several books: The Creative Destruction of Manhattan, Why Preservation Matters, and The End of the City? City's End, which is a fictional account of stories about New York and preservation. And he is also an activist. He is working on debt-free higher education, public higher education, which all of you should be interested in, of course, and currently leading the charge for the Mass Teachers Association on the Fair Share Amendment, which may historically introduced progressive taxation to Massachusetts to help enrich and fund public education and public transportation. So please welcome Max Page.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for inviting me. Thanks for giving me this time. As Matt said, I've been vice president of the Mass Teachers Association for nearly 4 years, and I really miss being in the classroom. So I kind of invited myself up to say, "Don't you want to hear a class about cities and architecture?" So I really appreciate it. All right. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to fly through a lot of slides, and I'm starting with this person in the mid 20th century, and I want to talk about the fights over how cities should be built. And I'm going to start with her in like the 50s and 60s, 1950s and 60s, but I know some of you are looking at European history, 19th century, the Gilded Age, because I'm going to go back to that a little bit, talk about what she was imagining for how cities should be built, and then I'm actually going to go even a little forward. But along the way, what I want to say is that this person and her writing, you can see she's leaning on her books. I'm going to talk about one book in particular, is a person who absolutely fundamentally influenced me and frankly generations of people who write about cities, architects, urban historians. If you go to college and study architecture or cities, you will almost guaranteed to read this book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, written in 1962 and yet still the most widely read book in architecture schools and in courses about cities. So she crucially influenced me. And yet what I want to say as a historian, and you are all budding historians, is that I also changed my view about her over time. So that even though you read a book, you read something, you think you know what it means, as time progresses and the world changes, our view on what these figures mean, what these events mean, changes. And I'm going to get to that at the end. All right, so Jane Jacobs. She's an architectural writer in New York City. In the 50s, she comes from Scranton, Pennsylvania. And she writes a lot of different articles for a lot of different magazines, but her most well-known book, and it becomes a big bestseller, is Death and Life of Great American Cities. And again, you may say, like, it's just one book, but the fact that it continues to be read, and in fact, it's being read more widely, even than it was 50 years ago, is a sign of the lasting power of this one book. And we can even talk about why it was so important. So, what Jane Jacobs did in this book is essentially lays out an urban utopia. So if you imagine, just pause in your moment, close your eyes if you want to, like imagine like what a perfect city looks like. This is her idea of a perfect city. That's her house on the left, the bright red one right next to the taller building. in Manhattan, in sort of Greenwich Village, the west side of Greenwich Village. Now, you may have looked at that and go like, that isn't what I expected to see when this guy just asked for us to think about what's a utopian city, what's an ideal city. If I had heard that, I normally would think like some perfectly pristine boulevard or grand public buildings and the like. But she said, no, this is the utopia. Okay, so that's the key thing, is why she's saying that at this moment. Let me just quickly show you where we are. Oh, there you see the little arrow there, West Village. She's on the west side of Manhattan, Greenwich Village, some of you know that well, in a little house on Hudson Street. Here's a view from her rooftop. You can probably, those of you know the architectural history or our terrible history in the US, that's the World Trade Center towers that, of course, were demolished by terrorists in 2001. So this is about 10 years before that. And there's me in the reflection at her house. There's 555 Hudson Street, which I would argue is the most important house in US urban and architectural studies, because it's from this house that she starts to make her idea. She develops her ideas of what is an ideal city. There's her backyard, and there she is on the left. That's her son, Ned. She moves from Scranton to New York in the 50s, and then actually leaves to protest the Vietnam War at the end of the 60s and moves to Toronto and becomes an activist and writer there as well. But it's partly because she did not want Ned to go fight in the Vietnam War. All right, so here's her neighborhood. It's a regular old urban neighborhood. Lots of stores in the front. There's houses and apartments up above, wide sidewalk, kind of bustling, kind of messy a little bit. Here's what she looked at from her, here's what she saw from the inside of her house. And she looked out. It was like, people walking down the street, sort of different, lots of different blocks, cafes on the street, but also kind of messy, kind of like there's some empty lots, some low buildings, older buildings, some taller apartment buildings from the 19th and early 20th century. You could look at this and go, it's kind of a rundown neighborhood. It's not so great. And that's the key thing, is that what her contribution was, and why the brilliance is that she looked out at the ordinary, what many people at the time, and as I'll get to, were saying is not just ugly and ordinary, but really problematic. And she said, actually, this is what cities are made of. This is the beginnings of an ideal city. You see, this is the view out of her backyard. Again, little backyards with lots of low buildings, but pretty dense, 3, 4, up to 6-story buildings, small little parks in the corner. And as I said, lots of businesses. So there's houses, stores, there's bars, famous tavern that gets up early for breakfast, that serves breakfast, but also is up till 3 in the morning for more alcoholic encounters. There's an old picture of that White Horse Tavern, been around for a long time, and there's Jane Jacobs. You can see her second from the right, sitting there at the White Horse Tavern, which she frequently went to and spent time writing Death and Life of Great American Cities. And there is the view out of that. And again, you look out and you see there's nothing like organized and architecturally beautiful in a simple way, but that was her genius. At a moment when people would look at this and say, it's a problem, we got to clean this place up, she took the opposite view. That was her brilliance. And what she essentially said was that it is that kind of messy city life of people on the street, stores, people going on different blocks, a mix of different kinds of incomes, fancier homes, fancy apartment buildings, smaller, more rundown buildings, that actually is what makes cities succeed. Okay, now, what's she reacting against? And this is where I want to start to go back in history. There's a reason she wrote this at this moment in the 1950s and 60s, is especially because of this guy, who you may probably also not have heard of yet, but you will, and if you keep going studying this subject. Robert Moses, most powerful unelected person in New York City history, and he looked in those neighborhoods and said, these are ancient neighborhoods, they got to be transformed, and the city has to be made, it needs to be accessible for the automobile, it needs to be more efficient, we got to clean things up. And so he was the great urban planner of the day who said, we got to wipe away a lot of the 19th century and 18th century city and build a modern city. And the reason they came into conflict is that he was imagining that they cut a new highway through Lower Manhattan, right through her neighborhood, which is right down at that interchange at the bottom of this slide. And he said, yeah, it's enough of these congested streets. Let's cut through. And this guy, Robert Moses, if you go to New York City, he built the FDR Drive, the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Drive on the east side, West Side Highway. He built Lincoln Center. He built parks all over the city. He built the Triborough Bridge, I-95. If you've been through I-95 in New York, that's Robert Moses' creation. Much of what you see there is the product of that time, and she was reacting against it. She fought against him. She was a great community organizer, and she really challenged a guy who was all-powerful at that time in deciding what bridges should be built, what tunnels, where highways should go. And this was one of his first defeats, is when she worked here. Here she is in Washington Square Park, if you've ever been there, rallying people against one of his projects. He actually wanted to cut right through a bigger highway, right through Washington Square Park, which is one of the great urban parks in the United States. And she won. And she stopped that highway, that cross Lower Manhattan Highway. And that led to other successes. First failures, this is Penn Station. Have you ever been to the train station in New York City? Well, now it's been improved, but it really was like a terrible place. It had once been glorious like this. This is what it looked like. And then, as many of you know, it was torn down. And then now for many, many years, it was just an underground windowless station. And the person who introduced me to Jane Jacobs and taught me first architectural history, Vincent Scully, used to say that we once entered the city like gods, and now we scuttle in like rats. And that's what it felt like if you've ever been to Penn Station. You were like in a tunnel, or I don't know, like at the bottom of a toilet bowl before you went on this train station. Versus, and this is what, because of her activism in wanting to protect the city, we still have Grand Central Station, one of the most glorious public buildings in the United States. But more important, she led, not single-handedly, but her book was so easy to read and so like humorous and just cutting and so a new way of looking at things that she turned the whole trajectory away from those big plans, cutting through highways, huge public housing complexes and the like. And turn things away towards historic preservation, saving our glorious buildings, but also just saving the fabric of the city, the kind of texture that she looked out on from 555 Hudson Street to that texture of life, and said that that's the way we should be going. And that's why we now have all over the place, Boston, every city really, you'll see kind of these red brick row houses or brownstones, and really a celebration of neighborhoods like that. So she led to this huge change. All right. She came from a critique of how cities had been built for the previous 100 years. And so let me just go way back. This is a picture actually of Manchester, one of the first and greatest industrial cities in the north of England. Here's a view of the countryside. That is, and then the distance, the smokestacks of Manchester that would come to define what a city was. Once, you would look at a city from a distance and you would just see church spires. Those would be the tallest buildings. Now the new church spires, you can still see some church spires there, but the taller things will be the smokestacks of the new factories. And you could see how some of the artists at the time would capture how literally the smoke had just obscured the entire city. And what came along with that was slums. This is Jacob Riis. Some of you may have read or seen pictures of the Danish photographer and writer in New York City capturing the slums, that people who from the countryside come into the city and now were forced to live in these back alleys, terrible conditions. Here are the slums in Manchester. And they were reacting to that. There was a reaction to that. There was also the recognition of the almost enslavement of workers, including young children, in these workplaces, working 12, 14-hour days, 6, 7 days a week. And there was a desire then, and here's Jacob Riis again, a photograph of Mulberry Bend in New York City, Lower Manhattan also, right near City Hall in New York, saying, we have to do something about this. We have to change this. And some of it was about lifting people up. There were some reformers who said, we have to change this because it's degrading where people live. Other people said, we got to break up these slums because this is where revolutions begin. It's all those radical socialist immigrants from Russia and from Italy who were flocking in to the United States in the 19th century, and they were worried about what happens in these slum districts when all these radical immigrants get together. So Mulberry Bend, in the late 19th century in New York City, one of the very first urban renewal efforts. They tore it down. Jacob Riis said, the only thing you can do is tear it down. You can't slowly reform things. You got to use the big hand of the state and just tear it down. And they turned it into this park you can see here. And they did this throughout. This is near the Manhattan Bridge looking, you can probably see the Empire State Building. This is a good bit later in the 30s. They leveled 5 full blocks in order to create a kind of a large park, but also just to disperse the people from these slums. There's a whole other tradition, like the socialist tradition in Europe. This is Vienna in the early 20th century, where they built public housing. That was another response, not just disperse, but let's build good public housing for working people. In the United States, we also built public housing. Many of it, though, was used to segregate away African American people from the rest of the city, from white Chicago in this case. These are the huge apartment blocks in the south side of Chicago. Similarly, in Pruitt-Igoe, this is the name of the housing complex in St. Louis, where they tore down building after building and said, we're going to build these new, glorious, clean apartment buildings. So remember this slide, we're going to come back to it. So that's part of the tradition, is slum clearance in order to either disperse or build new housing. And there were competing interests. Some of it was really mean-spirited, racist. Some of it was people who believed they were trying to uplift and provide better living conditions. There was also a grander vision of urban planning. Some people call this the City Beautiful movement. Let's beautify the city for everybody, and that will uplift and bring solidarity between working people and the capitalists and the working people. And here at the World's Columbian Exposition, 1893 in Chicago, they built this fantasy city of a kind of a updated Roman city, and this a huge percentage of Americans, I think like 1 in 5 Americans visited this fair, which is like a World's Fair where all these countries shared their great products and visions, but they built this temporary but glorious building, city, to inspire others. And there were all kinds of examples of cities following this idea. And here's actually a schematic idea by Daniel Burnham, an architect and planner, who imagined remaking Chicago on organized, rational lines, building transportation lines, public squares, getting away from kind of the messy city of the industrial period. And Daniel Burnham said this is a great line you might read about if you go on to study any of this. Make no little plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood, and probably themselves will not be realized. In other words, you got to think big. You got to be willing to take an axe to the city. I don't think he says this here, but elsewhere he said you got to use an axe when you're going through a city in order to achieve your vision. All right, there's another vision at the same time. All of this is going on late 19th century into the 20th century, imagining how do we make a new city, a modern city, and deal with the problems caused by industrialization. Another vision was, let's just get out of the city. This is a schematic of what was called the Garden City movement. Rather than keep building these huge cities and trying to fix them, let's create a whole satellite of smaller cities that are called garden cities. They have city centers, they have industry, but they're dispersed, and people all get to live close to the land, and agriculture is integrated with industry as well. This is the inspiration, in many ways, for the suburbanization, the rise of the suburbs that takes place all throughout the 20th century. And in the late 30s, there is another World's Fair. These World's Fairs become really important places where new ideas in city design get developed. This is Flushing Meadows, where the U.S. Open takes place in Queens, in New York. That Perisphere, the globe there, is still there. You can actually go still visit it. The Trilon, as it's called, the pyramidal shape is gone. But inside there, in the exhibits, they showed a vision of the future city. General Motors showed a plan what the future city would look like. Huge tall towers, leveled old buildings below, big highways, and then roads heading out to the suburbs so that people could live in the suburbs, zoom in on the 10-lane highways, and then go right into their work from their underground parking lots. This was the vision. This is actually the vision of the city of the future. And people, as you can see, they're sitting up above in this exhibition space, looking down on what the future city would look like. And this was part of the vision by many architects. One of the famous architects of the time, Le Corbusier. It's always cool just to have one name. Le Corbusier did not have a first name. And he said, let's remake this. In this case, it was Paris. He said, enough of this old medieval Paris. Level the whole thing, built 50-story skyscrapers, make it an efficient, healthy city. And he also, Le Corbusier, also came to Manhattan, which you see on the top slide, and he said, you know what, man, he went to the top of the Empire State Building, looked out, and he said, you know what, this is a provisional city. This is the temporary city. It's not yet where it needs to be. We need to do more leveling in order to create the modern city of the future. And many places took this to heart. So this is left side. This is a picture of right around the bridge at Cambridge Street, where Mass General Hospital is in downtown Boston. It's called the West End. You see the word at the top? It says an obsolete neighborhood. An obsolete neighborhood. There's thousands and thousands of people living in those, in the kind of the black squares. You can see those are all an old immigrant neighborhood. But they said it's obsolete. It's over. We got to get rid of it. And so what they did, and they actually did this. This is not just a plan. They just leveled all of it and built a whole series of towers. And if you go there today, you will still see that right around Mass General Hospital, right behind the State House in downtown Boston, one of the huge urban renewal projects in Boston. And they said, isn't that beautiful? A new plan that will make for much better, healthy living. And you can see, here's what they demolished. They kept a few historic buildings. That's Mass General on the top left. The rest of it, they just completely destroyed. And then the garden cities, that became one of the biggest movements of all, is leave the city for those who could afford it and those who were of the white race to be able to be admitted into communities in the suburbs. Like this, farmland, potato farms, becomes Levittown. Ticky houses, one after the other. When it's built, Levittown, a suburb of New York, does not allow black people to purchase a home there. It's written right into the deed. You cannot sell this. It's actually black. Asiatic was the name it was used. Jewish, you could not be in there. That changed the law changed, but actually there were almost no black people there for the next 30 or 40 years. So the suburbs also equaled racial segregation. But it envisioned, it put out this idea of the ideal American home, the white family, 2.5 kids, little house on a plot of land. What came with that also was not the dense kind of stores in a city, but rather the suburban mall, and ultimately the covered mall. Okay, this is a planner. I just use this as a kind of a symbol of what Jane Jacobs hated about all of those plans that I just went through. She lumped them all together. The garden cities, the housing reformers, the city beautiful types. She said all of them are about some planner, a guy usually, looking down upon the city and moving the pieces around and making way for the car, and just using this kind of literally top-down sort of, the all-powerful dictator and genius approach to remaking a city. It's the bird's eye view. And she said, you need to understand what life is like at the street, on the street level. So that's where we get back to this, to her urban utopia. And it's really an important thing to think about, that how paradigms shift. Because everyone, when she was starting to write in the 40s and 50s, were like, of course we need new highways. Oh yeah, we need those suburbs. We need the suburban malls. And it took an incredible piece of writing. And just to like turn the vantage point for people to go, well, actually, it is kind of nice to live there. It is kind of nice to live above your stores, to not have to get in a car every time you want to go shopping. It is nice that there's lots of people on the streets from 5 a.m. until 2 in the morning, because there's so much density, there's so many stores, there's so many different types of people living here. That's actually kind of nice, that kind of diversity. The mixed uses, industrial uses, commercial uses, residential uses. That was considered absolutely terrible by the planners of the day. People should live over here, industry should be over here, and you should go shopping in the shopping mall over there. Keep them separated, those uses. She said, no, actually, isn't it nice to live here? So that's just something to think about, how received thinking, things we think about as second nature, are actually maybe not the right things at all. And a different vantage point can shift us. All right. Remember, I showed you this before. This is the Pruitt-Igoe housing complex in St. Louis. So this is built in 1959. It is a symbol of the visionary possibilities of architecture and planning. Get rid of those old buildings, red brick buildings, build towers. This is good for the people who lived there. It's torn down about 13 years later. What happened? Partly what happened is Jane Jacobs happened. She helped spur such a shift away from the urban planning approach of the previous years that finally people started looking in detail at the experience of people in these buildings and found they actually didn't make less crime, they made more crime. They didn't create greater health, they created less health. They actually felt like this is the wrong way to go. And so this becomes a symbol, when this is torn down, of kind of the end of an era of all that kind of top-down planning, and a celebration of Jane Jacobs. I went to college and read her in 1984, and it was still kind of it was like the orthodoxy. She was kind of the Bible, like this is how you build cities. All right, so now last piece of this presentation, I hope I have a little time, which is to say how I've changed my view, somewhat, on her. And over time, as the world has changed, as my own thinking has changed, I went from being kind of an acolyte, kind of like a true believer, and everything Jane Jacobs said is absolutely right, to starting to question it. So let's go back to Robert Moses, the great planner that people came just absolutely vilified, also because of another book. Robert Caro, C-A-R-O, wrote a book called The Power Broker. It's about, 1,400 pages long. But it basically just vilified Robert Moses. And it was one of the things that turned people against urban renewal and this whole approach as well. But there started to be a different thinking. And I'll tell you why in a second. So there he is. He helped build the United Nations building. That's the FDR Drive in the background. He's standing up there on a beam for one of the bridges that's being built. He built the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, on and on. And people started in the 80s and into the 90s started going like, well, but he built all these quite incredible things that we still use, like massive public pools, like Jones Beach, public beaches. Now I will note that he also built highway overpasses or underpasses that were very low so that buses, which would most likely be taken by working class people and especially African Americans, couldn't get there. So there's a deep racism also rooted in his work. But let's hold both at the same time. He also built these grand public beaches. He built Lincoln Center, one of the premier cultural centers of the United States. And why did people, and myself included, start to go like, Robert Moses, maybe he had something. It's because other countries, we started to see in the post-war period, especially accelerating in the 70s, 80s, 90s, into the 21st century, were realizing they were building high-speed rail systems. This is in Tokyo. They were building bridges. They were building new airports. They were building massive public projects that we in the United States had stopped doing. We had pulled away from kind of public investments in the common good. Okay. The other thing is that I started changing my view on is like that utopia I talked about. Remember how beautiful little utopia of that place where lots of working class people and middle income and wealthier people could all live together in perfect harmony? Well, look, this is when I went to visit her house. This was many years ago now. $3.5 million for her tiny little house. This is probably $10 million now. In other words, this little house that she looked at on that urban utopia is actually a highly expensive neighborhood. The house is expensive. The neighborhood has been gentrified. And so you start to wonder, well, it's not such a utopia after all, is it? That she imagined somehow this perfect mix of things, this messy mix could be a healthy, wonderful community. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it turned out to be a place for only the wealthy to live. And then the last thing I'll say about the critique is that when she was writing, 1962, was just before the United States' laws changed on immigration, and we saw a huge influx of what I'll call them new immigrants. Immigration had been largely kind of stopped in the middle of the 20th century, actually from the 20s up till the 60s, but then it opened up again, and suddenly we had the greatest influx of new people from around the world that we had since the late 19th century that some of you are studying. and people from new places around the world. Many of you, your parents, your grandparents, may have been part of that generations of immigrants that started coming in the 60s and 70s. Why do I say that? Because one of the things that's weird about Death and Life of Great American Cities, if you ever come to read it, is that she's writing in Greenwich Village. You may have heard of Greenwich Village, but it is the artistic, cultural center of much of the 20th century in New York City. It is where some of the greatest jazz players play at the Village Vanguard. It's where counterculture, people like Allen Ginsberg, people who are just challenging sexual mores, gender construction, are challenging the way people are supposed to live. We're living and working and talking. Jack Kerouac, you may have heard that book, On the Road. Here he is sort of giving a public presentation of it in a club in Greenwich Village. And also Stonewall, right? Stonewall is the bar that kind of led to the modern gay rights movement. That's around the corner from where she lived on Hudson Street. But what's incredible is you do not actually see anything in the book about that, or about Andy Warhol and the modern art movements of the time. What's stunning in that book is that it's really not about the kind of cultural ferment and revolutions that were going on all around her. In some ways, it's kind of a conservative book. That's how I came to see it. I used to think of it as like the community action, community organizer Bible, but over time, I started to say, like, what about all the incredible diversity we now have in our cities? What's the guide for how to build cities like that? And that is in many ways the kinds of cities I think we all and you all will probably gravitate to. You maybe go to college and then you'll move to a city, as you should. Everyone should live in New York for a little while. But there's a reason why people are gravitating back to cities away from the suburbs still, even at the time of the pandemic, because it is in cities where you find the diversity of ideas and of people that I think we all celebrate. And let me just end with my favorite building of all in the whole country, which is where I wrote this first book, I didn't write The Death and Life of Great American Cities, where I wrote The Creative Destruction of Manhattan, was the New York Public Library. And if you ever haven't been there, it's right near Grand Central, which, like as I said, it was also one of our great public buildings 2 blocks over. You go in there, one of the greatest libraries in the world. You can ask for any book in there, no card needed, no pay, obviously. And it's also a place where all of New York gathers. I would sit and I was a PhD student sitting there writing, and across the way was an immigrant studying for the SAT, and there was another person writing, studying their genealogy. Incredible, capturing of all the diversity of the city in a public building, a purely public building, free and open to all. And that is a vision that Jane Jacobs, I think, we can still draw on her for, but it is something that she didn't see. And here's what she didn't see in 1960, that we would live in a world today where that notion of the common good and the public good and building public projects that are held in common by all of us was just not as important. There's so much wealth inequality and there's so much reliance on the private sector that she couldn't see that happening at the time. So in some ways the book is of its time in the 60s, and what we need is a new model and a new vision for how do we build diverse cities that build solidarity among all peoples and all races. And I'll leave that all up to you. All right, thank you.
So we have a microphone here for questions from any of the classes. So if people want to come up and they have particular questions, you can line up here, and Professor Page will do his best to answer them. You won't get extra credit in my class to ask questions, but it'll put you in good standing. I don't know about Ms. Cherry and Ms. Robb. And so come on up. You can line right up here if you have questions. And Professor Page will answer them graciously.
Hi. I was just wondering, if you know where she grew up, what life she had before she moved to that apartment, and how she came to those conclusions.
Thanks for that question. I should have said it. So she grew up in Scranton, Pennsylvania, which is a small city. She was the daughter of a doctor. But she actually, I'm glad you mentioned this because she dedicates the book not to her children or her husband. She says she dedicates it to New York, where I found my future. So she, I don't think she knew what she was going to be and knew that she loved cities. She just moved there. She had a husband who was an architect, actually, and they decided to move to the city. And I think it's simply her life there and her openness to experiencing the city that led her to decide to write this book. So where she found herself. I think that's what she said. To New York, where I found myself. Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
I have a question, and I'm not even sure how to ask it, but folks your age are living much of your life online, right? Like social media, et cetera. How does that impact cities? We've now got this place called cyberspace.
Right.
So I'm curious about the intersection between those things. I think about the, our infrastructure when it comes to Wi-Fi, and there's parts of our countries that have very limited access to it. There's parts that have incredible access to it. So I'm just curious, because I know for these folks, just not having access to their phone just for this is a challenge for them.
Right.
And then that's just an observation, it's not a judgment. But
Right.
so what impact has our changing means of communication and where we're spending a lot of our times where it's sort of inward, how's
Right.
that affecting cities or is
No,
it having
that's
an
a
effect?
very good question. First thing I'll say is, and this isn't exactly what you were asking, but there has been for decades and decades, this sense of whatever the latest technology is will finally be the end of the city, and that this will finally render cities unuseful. And it was the telephone. It was the airplane, the internet. That was even the internet, pre-iPhones and pre-smartphones. And the smartphone, well, of course, you can be anywhere in the world and you could do your business and the like. So why do we need cities? And yet at the same moment, cities were growing larger and larger. New York actually stalled at 7.9 million in population in the end of World War II, and it took 50 years, because of suburbanization, for the city itself to grow past 8 million, and it did that in the year 2000. So it grew beyond there. So here's what I would say is, it changes, obviously, the day-to-day experience and what happens in cities, but in some ways, I think it makes cities even more important. Because whether you all agree with this or not, social media can be isolating. It feels like you're connected everywhere, but in fact, it can feel very isolating. In fact, there's lots of arguments to say that its presence on all the different social media sites actually promotes an epidemic of depression, frankly. It's a real concern. And what we're seeing, though, is that even with these devices, people want to be in cities in public life, which is why there's been this desperation to return out in public life. So I actually don't think, in some ways I think the isolation of our lives that comes with the internet and social media bizarrely actually encourage us to be in cities even more.
Thank you.
Sure. Hi.
Hi, Mr. Bogg asked us a question in class, but I was wondering what your opinion on it was. Are the problems of the city solved through design, or are they fundamental problems of economic inequality?
Okay, so just so everyone here, so are cities a problem of design?
Yeah.
Or of fundamental
problems.
economic inequities? Excellent question. So here's a good professor answer. It's both. But here's what I'll say. One thing I didn't say of the critique of Jane Jacobs, or the way she was used, is people said, oh, cool. So now I can just follow the recipe, the design recipe that Jane Jacobs set up. We'll make some small blocks, so there's lots of people moving back and forth and throughout the neighborhood. We'll make industry and commerce and residences all together, so that we'll design houses and buildings like that. It became, in many ways, a guidebook for a design solution, as if that would solve other problems. And I think when I was saying at the end, I was showing how expensive her house had become and how gentrified, meaning wealthy people only live in that neighborhood, it was a sign that design could not solve those deeper inequities. That neighborhood looks largely as it did because of her efforts. They preserved that neighborhood, and it's a lovely neighborhood to walk around. You just can't afford to live there. And that's a real problem if you're trying to design a city that's made for all different types of people and all different types of incomes. So one of the other things that has happened over the past 50 years, as well as the pulling away from public good, or part and parcel of pulling away from kind of public projects and public, the public projects for the common good, is a vast inequality. So I totally agree that the basis of a healthy neighborhood has to be that people have the basics of what they need to live and to thrive. And design can help the interaction and can help provide people with the open space that they need and help them, provide for access to culture and work, but it cannot supplant the basic equity that we need.
Where do you think, or how do you think New York would change in 50 years from now? Like
Can you say it a little louder?
What changes in New York do you think would change in 50 years, or what major differences you think there would be?
What changes would I would suggest be made now?
Yeah.
Good, excellent question. Well, so part of it is reinvesting the kinds of things that Jane Jacobs assumed would always be invested in, like public transportation, like public schools, like free public higher ed, which is the City University of New York used to be absolutely tuition free for all residents of the city. And I will say, when I was walking there recently in New York, there's a new whole Brooklyn Bridge park that they've built, just a wonderful park that's both for wandering around and as well as tennis courts and soccer fields. There does remain underneath all the gross inequality in the city, there's an undercurrent still of a commitment to public life that used to be there. So we have to build on that. We have to build on the still existing both investments in public good. But again, everyone needs to have the basics, and there are far too many people in one of the wealthiest cities in the wealthiest country in the world that are living in absolute poverty. When I moved to New York, I actually, after college, I worked for the city in some of the homeless shelters. This was the late 80s, and this was the first boom of the Wall Street world. And all these skyscrapers were going up. A lot of my colleagues were working for these investment firms, and yet homelessness was absolutely exploding. 60,000 people a night were sheltered just by the city itself. People without a home, without a decent home to live in. So part of what those public investments have to be affordable housing, public housing. True public housing that is built throughout neighborhoods across the city so people have the basics that they need to live. Thanks for the question.
I have one question. There's one movement that your presentation did not cover, and it struck me when you initially said that people came to the city to serve industry initially as wage labor, and then people very soon realized that this was going to be a place where radicalism could be cultivated or activism, and so that was one of the original sparks to see how can we change the political contestation of the city. Now, the current sort of discourse is about smart cities and about collecting data, and Ms. Rob's question kind of sparked this in my mind, the idea that we can see how people move at all times based on collecting data through surveillance of their cell phones, where they shop, where they go. We can make the city an apolitical place because data can make all the decisions for us. And I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
No, that's a very good point, Matt. One of the reasons young people have always gone from the countryside or small towns to the city, like New York, but at many other cities, is for anonymity, right? To get away from get away from kind of the watchful eye of parents and community members, and actually just be who they want to be, or discover who they want to be in a city where, although it seems odd to be anonymous, but in fact you can be anonymous in this huge city. So there is a real danger about the watchfulness of the all-seeing eye of the internet and those cameras. That's very true. I'm not sure what the answer to that is, except fighting back against that. But I want to talk about more about that, how we fight it. But it is an absolute danger.
You said that your favorite building in the U.S. is the New York Public Library. What would you say your favorite building in the world is?
Oh, goodness. That's a great question. I'm not sure it wouldn't still be the public library. I'm trying to think of other places that I found. I mean, I had the privilege of visiting a number of different cities in order to develop a course on cities, and I did get up literally at 4 a.m., pitch dark, and go to, literally could see absolutely nothing, and you went to the Taj Mahal and just sat on a bench and watched the Taj Mahal, the light come up on that incredible complex, and then you understood why it is considered one of the most beautiful places on earth. But I still come back to after 9/11, lots of people were talking about, like, what is it we cherish about the city that was threatened by terrorists that killed 3,000 people and demolished those towers. And it was, for me, the public library, not just because it's so beautiful as a work of architecture, but because of the sight of sitting at one end of those desks, these big oak desks, and just seeing this sea of New Yorkers of all different types doing their own kind of, as Toni Morrison, the writer, said, public contemplation, private contemplation in public. And that's what I love about a place like that. It's not just the architecture, it's what happens inside.
I was just wondering, when they knock down like a building, what do they do with like the people that live there or the companies that work there?
When they knock down during like urban renewal?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a good question. As I said early on, it was like we literally have to disperse them, like tear it down. They will disperse, and all their disease and all their kind of radicalism and whatever else will disperse. Where, though? Sometimes there was then public housing built. Sometimes that was a combination. We're going to tear this down to build a highway or whatever else, and then we're going to also build public housing into which the neighborhood people can move into. But almost always, there were lots of people left out of that equation. There weren't enough housing for the people, or the dispersal of them upset their lives and they moved elsewhere. So in other words, it was not a perfect system at all.
Thank you.
Sure. Question?
Why do you think there's such a struggle in city public schools compared to, say, a public school in a suburban area?
Simply put, wealth. I mean, the bottom line is we have in our urban districts people who are impoverished or without the kind of living wages that they maybe once had or certainly should have. And there's a whole number of things that flow from that. And we have schools that are underfunded, fundamentally underfunded, and have been. And we, actually, Matt, your professor, has been also working on this, that we've actually started to reinvest in our public schools. But there's been 20, 30 years and beyond where those schools, which probably need more, actually have less. And that's partly because of a system, especially in Massachusetts, where we pay for our public schools based on the property values of our town. Well, how silly is that? So if you live in a wealthy town, the property values are high, the taxes therefore generate more money for investments in the schools, and impoverished districts do not have that. So that's one of the absolutely central issues. And then, of course, our cities tend to have more people of color who are working class people. That's the product of decades and more of racial segregation and racial discrimination. So it all sort of spins together.
Thank you.
I have a similar question about the specialized schools or the specialized high schools in New York City, and whether you think those 9 schools increase or diminish the economic inequality in New York City.
Excellent question. Obviously, we're having this big debate about specialty schools or exam schools in Boston right now. I'll admit that I have a mixed set of feelings about it, because in many ways, they remain discriminatory. The admissions policies absolutely remain discriminatory, and they kind of reinforce the inequities. On the other hand, there's a long tradition, and I don't know if New York's exam schools worked different than in Boston, but there's many, many thousands and thousands of working class immigrants who were able to then go into these schools, and then that helped launch them into whatever kind of careers. What seems a problem is the notion that to get the kind of facilities, to get the kind of class sizes you need, you have to get into one of these very selective schools. Shouldn't every school have that level of investment? Why should it have to be that this special school over there has what everyone else needs? And just as a reminder, like in this state, in many states, there's more than enough money to provide that level of quality school buildings and number of staff in every school, if we simply asked those with the very most money to contribute more. In other words, it shouldn't be a zero-sum game. Like, well, we get the fancy Boston Latin school, therefore we have to cut back over here on the regular public school.
Thank you.
All right, I guess so. My sort of question is, do you think that as future progresses and as technology also progresses with it, that more and more people are going to be just moving into cities, and that sort of rural areas are going to be like abandoned, and like these sort of super cities would be created over time?
Well, good question. I mean, we actually have been in the midst of the greatest urbanization in the history of the world over the past maybe 30, 40 years. There's a question about whether the pandemic will interrupt that, but in fact, we've seen an incredible growth, and frankly, the growth has been bigger in other countries. I mean, the largest cities in the world are no longer in the United States, and in some ways, our cities have been growing, but not nearly as much as name a million cities: Lagos, Mexico City, Singapore, Tokyo, Shanghai, and the like have been growing exponentially. What we have been seeing in the U.S. and in other places is the flight from rural areas. And again, it seems counterfactual, right? If we have the ability just to sit in a house, in a farm somewhere, and do our business on the internet, why are people fleeing those places? In fact, both economically and culturally, people want to be in cities.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed it. You guys always have great questions.